Hey, yo, welcome into Carp's Corner, man. Juiced up, coming off the Halloween weekend, a tremendous slate of college football games that we had. Some good NFL matchups as well. Some big news from the NFL. We've got some big news this week in college football as the first rankings will come out. Some news out of Dallas, Fort Worth, potentially moving on from a coach down there who was one of the longest tenured coaches in all of college football and who had been wildly successful, and break down some of these big games and kind of what to expect as well from the college football playoff rankings, the first rendition, and what will be the first of many, and where we think these teams will ultimately go from here. And what do we think ultimately is going to happen? Will it resemble the AP or will it not? And what the differences will be. And it does matter some. I believe no team has climbed further from 7 to ultimately make the playoff since they started in this very brief and recent history. So for Cincinnati, going to be big tonight to see where they land, to see where they ultimately anchor them. But wanted to start with the Gary Patterson news of him parting ways with TCU down at Fort Worth. And if you look at Gary Patterson, he takes over from Dennis Franchione, back about 20 years ago. And with what he did with TCU and turning them from a program that was really conferenceless, identityless, and then building them into this team that thrived on defense. And then you bring in Andy Dalton, you kind of turn that thing over, you turn it into an offensive juggernaut, you combine that with some really good defense, you win a Rose Bowl. Like Gary Patterson did some things at TCU that I don't even know if any Horned Frog fans or alums thought was even possible. And with what he was able to do over the last 20 years, and then shepherd them into the Big 12 to where, until recently, and not to wipe any of that away, the recent history is the recent history. And the Horned Frogs were not producing at the level that they had for so many years under Gary Patterson. So you get to the point, changes, do they need to be made? And I'll get to why I think that needed, why it happened. Not that I necessarily believe that it needed to, but why I think you're going to see a little bit more of this here in the coming couple months, and maybe even in the next season as this conference realignment begins to kind of take hold and take shape. But started out, Conference USA, they go to Mountain West, they're remnants of the Southwest Conference there, and finally get into the Big 12. You could argue in 2014, TCU, Baylor, they had as good of claim, a legitimate claim as potentially Ohio State did to slide into that 4th spot. Neither of those schools get in. Ohio State goes on and wins the national championship, and maybe the fortunes are different. I don't know if either one of those teams could have beat Bama. I don't probably think they could have, but he would have been Gary Patterson taking a team to a college football playoff at TCU, and something that I don't think they would have ever thought was possible. And heck, he already had won a Rose Bowl by that point and done such a fantastic job. Like, he had really checked all the boxes, and to turn TCU into a football powerhouse. His level of recruiting, you look at the guys that he's put in the NFL, and for a long time he was right on par right there with Texas and Oklahoma. And so much so that during the realignment, and when they're sitting in the Texas state legislature and they're talking about these different congressmen and women and state representatives about how upset they are that Texas and Oklahoma are leaving the Big 12 and joining the SEC, and talking about, beating up, there's better opportunities there. And the line was thrown out, so you can go lose to Alabama, as if losing to Texas wasn't enough, or losing to TCU wasn't enough if you're Texas. And that goes to show, if you look at what Gary Patterson was able to do, 7-3 against Texas during their time in the Big 12. So fantastic job by Gary Patterson, what he did. Last couple of years, not as good, faded off. But if you look at this, 20 years, he has a record of 181-79 at a place like TCU that did not necessarily have the pedigree for winning. So unbelievable results. Jerry Kill is going to take over. He was the former Minnesota coach. He's got some head coaching experience. They offered to give him the Ed Orgeron treatment, to let him finish out the season. Gary Patterson is a proud man. He is a football guy. He wants to coach football. I don't think he wanted to be a figurehead. He didn't want to be a lame duck and just hang around. And no matter how much he loves coaching at TCU, he wasn't going to do that, knowing that there was no future there for him. And so following the 31-12 loss to Kansas State, and there's a little fight, little melee that breaks out. You know, he's gone through a lot there. They've had some different issues. I don't know if I'd go as far as to call them scandals, but they have had some issues with the program. But a small school in Fort Worth, a private school, to eventually rise to the ranks where it was normal and expected to see TCU in the top 10 and always in the top 25. Gary Patterson, you tip your cap. And with him leaving, I believe now, I mean, Kirk Ferentz and him were just about the same years. Now Kirk is, by far the longest tenured head coach at one school currently in college football, with him being at Iowa. So, happy trails to Gary Patterson. I think he's going to keep coaching again. And I don't think that he's going to, just go and retire and run away. He is a football dude. He loves the game. He loves being involved in it. And you can see the passion with which he coaches defense. Now, I think that you're going to be seeing more of this. And this is going to happen probably in the Big 12, maybe in the AAC. I think Texas and Oklahoma, obviously Oklahoma with Lincoln Riley, they have their guy. Texas, I think they feel like they have theirs with Sark, even though he's broken a lot of records that Tom Herman never broke, as far as, the number of losses, the size of losses, who they're losing to right now. And so Texas has their work cut out for them to get back into it. But as we watch some of these teams move, you have to think in the next 2 years, the Big 12 is going to look a lot different. I don't know what the AAC, how that'll all end up shaking out. There's a lot of movement. They're bringing teams in there, and there still might be more movement over the next 5 years. But if the Big 12 is able to kind of garner that automatic bid when they have this college football expansion talk, everybody wants to be very well positioned to make that push. And so whether that's them bringing Sonny Dykes or whoever it might be at Texas, TCU, Texas Christian, these schools, as they're moving around, the power vacuum is going to be open with Texas and Oklahoma moving out. It is going to be wide open. And there's going to be people in Game of Thrones style trying to figure out who is going to be the elite player. Is it a TCU? Baylor looks to be well positioned to move forward. Cincinnati's coming in, going strong, assuming Coach Fickle stays there. How do the Bearcats look when they enter? But there will be this power void and this vacuum that's going to exist. And it's going to exist for recruiting. Who can go there and establish themselves as the preeminent player in the Big 12? And so maybe if you're not going to OU, maybe if you're not going to Texas and you don't want to go to the SEC or whatever it is, or Texas A&M, who's going to be there to scoop you up, especially in a talent-rich state like Texas? Is it TCU? You're looking at Baylor. They're looking pretty good. There's a lot of schools that are kind of on the come up now and trying to figure that out in the middle of America. Who's going? Is it Oklahoma State? With Mike Gundy, does he survive all this? He's looking good. Obviously they've got a loss, but he's moving, it looks like, that program back into the right direction. Could Oklahoma State be the preeminent player in the Big 12? But that's what I think you're going to see, is schools lining up, especially if they are a new AD, that they don't have an allegiance to that head coach, to say, I'm getting my guy, and we're going to shepherd in the new era of whatever school it is within this new look Big 12. And so they want to make sure they can hit the ground running and not be hiring a new head coach right as the transition's occurring. You want to have them established so they can have recruiting ties, they can have the track record and everything that you need moving forward. So keep an eye on some of these different schools as they begin to teeter a little bit. I think they'll err on the side of potentially bringing in a new coach as opposed to riding out the guy they already have. Before we get into the games, I wanted to look at a couple things, in the NFL. Dallas Cowboys last night, huge win, look really good, beat the Minnesota Vikings. And I'm just sitting here watching this, and you've got some of these players, Terrell Bishop and Randy Gregory, defensive ends, defensive linemen for the Dallas Cowboys. You're getting after players. It's intense. There's late whistles. People are trying to push the pile. I'm done with some of these late hits, with some of the stuff that's being called that is so ticky-tack and insignificant to the game. And it impacts the competitive balance immensely. 15 yards in an NFL game is ridiculous. And you look at the hit of Bishop on Kirk Cousins. He hits him right in the chest, waist area, as Cousins is falling away outside of the pocket as he is releasing the football. And I watched that come down and I'm trying to figure out what he did other than make a football play. There has got to be some sort of regulation with this because Dallas Cowboys have won maybe anyway. Yeah, probably, at least based upon how it played out. But I don't know what you expect defensive football players to do. I don't know what you expect football players in general to do anymore. I'm all for protecting the quarterback. I'm all for player safety and making sure that we're doing it the smartest and best way possible. But there has got to be some accountability for the officials that are just always going to err on the side of kind of looked bad. Like he literally didn't have the ball in his hand when he was getting hit. So it's got to be a late hit. You have to remember how fast this game is and how quick it moves for these players. It is unbelievably hard to redirect and change course in a split second or in an instant. And so let's just keep that in mind. And then speaking of redirecting and changing course, Tennessee Titans, what they're about to deal with now. Their star running back, Derrick Henry, who's been fantastic all year, and Mike Vrabel said they're going to run him until the wheels fall off. Well, maybe one of the wheels finally did. And it's being reported now that the 6-2 Titans, they're just coming off a big overtime win versus the Colts. It looks like they've got the AFC South under wraps. Houston struggling, obviously. Jacksonville's not great. Indy was their big competition. They just beat them in overtime. And now Derrick Henry is going to have foot surgery, is going to be out for an undisclosed amount of time. Just a season ender, maybe. I'm not entirely sure how that'll ultimately shake out, but he's going to be out for a significant period of time. And as big as he is, as explosive he is, foot injuries, the twisting, the turning, the amount of torque that a guy like him is putting on that, going to be tough to come back from. I wish him the best. I hope he does. Titans are sitting there at 6-2, and you have to feel like they're kind of a viable playoff contender and a Super Bowl contender potentially in the AFC. If you look, beating Kansas City, beating Buffalo with Derrick Henry, they had all the ingredients that they ultimately needed to get that done. And now he's going to be sidelined. I don't know if it's for the rest of the year, but you don't typically see guys coming back from foot injuries and being as effective, especially someone as big and as explosive as Derrick Henry. Now let's take a look, at some of these games and where things kind of broke out this weekend. Number one, we had Michigan State, phenomenal football game in East Lansing. You had 6 and 8, I believe, pairing off. They're now sitting there ranked at 9 and 5, and I think that that's about how it should have been. The line was 3.5, 4 points. I thought before the Spartans would have to hold, Michigan to probably, about 100 yards rushing. And if they could somehow match that with Kenneth Walker, the third, I thought they'd be in business because I thought they had a better quarterback situation and better receivers. Well, what do I know? Kenneth Walker, the third, I thought he'd have to grind out an ugly 100 yards. The dude rips off almost 2 bills, 5 touchdowns, is the driving force of that offense. Meanwhile, the Michigan State defense bows up. They do a great job of slowing down the duo of Corum and Haskins. Michigan doesn't even have 150 yards rushing to their credit on the offensive side of the ball. Now, Cade McNamara has a great game, throws for close to 400 yards, does throw an interception, but being up 16 points, coming back, a pair of 2-point conversions, a pair of touchdowns late in the game when they need them. Kenneth Walker was there to make a play each and every time his team needed it. I'm telling you, I thought Michigan State would win. I thought it would be close, but I didn't think I'd be this impressed with how well they played. They looked really good. They're offensively very diverse. They made some big plays. One rough note, it looked like Jalen Naylor had a cast on his hand at the end of the game. I didn't see him out there playing. If he has to miss an extended period of time, that could be tough because Michigan State has Ohio State the weekend before Thanksgiving, finishes with Penn State, and they're the highest ranked Big Ten team right now in all of college football, and they should be based upon who they've beaten and how they have looked. They have looked very, very good. And I credit both coaches in this, both Mel Tucker at Michigan State, who's one of the hottest coaches right now in the market. We'll see if he gets offered that LSU job. Speaking to some people involved with LSU, someone would prefer an offensive guy. Mel's done a great job. I don't want to see him leave Michigan State, but I can understand if he does, if they offer him the world down there. And I don't think they'd be wrong in doing it based upon what we've seen. They were picked to finish dead last in the Big Ten East, potentially 3 to 4 wins as their season win total, and he has flipped that on its head. Well done, Mel Tucker. And both him and Jim Harbaugh, though, playing very aggressive, coaching to win the games. Going up top early in the game. It's a 3rd and 7. Cade McNamara, not known for throwing the football all over the place. Michigan, not known for having, the great receiving corps since some of the injuries to Bell, injury to Bell earlier this season. But Andrew Anthony, number 1, which they don't give out at Michigan lightly, playing receiver, a $155, basically through the air, 2 touchdowns and a 93-yarder to open the game and blow that thing open for Michigan State. Jim Harbaugh playing to win early, being aggressive on 3rd down, being aggressive on 4th down, being a little too aggressive, bringing J.J. McCarthy back in and his fumble potentially costing the Wolverines a chance to win that game and seal it up, and giving the Spartans, what seemed like maybe some new life there as he's kicking the ball all over the place. And that's tough. It's tough. When you burn plays like that, it can be hard. And so it looked like maybe going to the well one too many times with J.J. McCarthy. But on 4th down, you have Mel Tucker. It's 4th and 1. Instead of just running it, taking the shot over the middle, trusting your quarterback, big 40-yard chunk. Those are the plays. Those are the aggressive plays that you have to be willing to make. And it's easy to sit there and say they're good calls when they work out. I love it, whether they work out or not. And I thought both of the coaches played aggressive. They called a game to win, and that's how you're supposed to do it. Ohio State, Penn State. Ohio State didn't look great. Penn State's defensive line was able to, do some things up front. Penn State's front 7, including their linebackers, played really good. They slowed Ohio State's rushing attack tremendously in the first half. Took Travion Henderson to the second half to get going. Now he finishes with over 150 yards rushing, but it didn't look as good. It didn't look as clean. And I think everybody was anticipating that team that was at Illinois, who gave up close to 350, 400 yards on the ground, and how dominant Illinois was pounding the football, just being content to grind that thing out. Penn State stepped up. It's always a big game, Penn State and Ohio State. And so they lose 33-24. But Sean Clifford showed me a lot. He played really, really tough. It wasn't an incredibly clean game by him. He's an Ohio kid, wanted to come in there, play hard and play well. I thought he did all that. And he gave his team a chance to win. And settling for field goals late is something that Ohio State is not going to be able to do against the likes of a Michigan and a Michigan State later in the year. They're going to have to turn those drives where they penetrate deep into opposing territory. Those have to be touchdowns. And we saw at Michigan State, they're converting touchdowns. Ohio State was not able to do that in a high clip in the second half. Olave looked pretty good. Ohio State's defense played pretty well, but there's still a little bit of meat on that bone. But the defensive line is continuing to come around. And even without Tyleik Williams getting a lot of reps or making any big plays, I thought that they've handled themselves and played pretty well. Some other, quick games in the Midwest. Wisconsin beating Iowa. Iowa looked awful. Couldn't run the ball, couldn't throw the ball. Wisconsin's finally got the run game going. Graham Mertz didn't play great, but didn't cost them the game. They went 27-7. It's going to probably come down to Wisconsin and Minnesota now for the Big Ten West title. If Minnesota hadn't lost to Bowling Green, you'd feel a lot better about them, but they're playing well. But Iowa has just faded so dramatically. It dropped back to 19th in the polls. And if Wisconsin would have played better early on, you'd feel better about them, but you're curious if that's still inside of them. In that team that has struggled there, if you can take away their running game, how quickly does their defense wear down? And what does Graham Mertz do when he's not supported in a big way? Notre Dame gets a win over UNC. That's helping Cincinnati. It's their backstop. It is their most signature win. And I've said it before, I think Notre Dame's going to probably win 10 games, maybe even 11. They're not a great team, but they're better than just about everyone else on their schedule. And they don't play any of those elite teams this year. And so they're going to be fine. And they're going to probably win a lot of these close games the way that they've been doing with Virginia Tech, with North Carolina. They pulled away on USC, but that is going to be their recipe for winning. Brian Kelly's got this team playing pretty well. And, they're not a playoff team, but they're pretty close. And they're just on that first tier outside, I think, of, the top 5, 6, 7 teams, in college football. Big story out of the SEC. And I don't know how the experts get this right. Auburn was favored against Ole Miss, and Auburn has been as bipolar as anybody this year. And they ride with Bo Nix, their quarterback. When he's good, they're pretty good. When he's bad, well, they struggle, and they can struggle mightily because they can't sustain drives. Their defense is really talented, but if you leave them on the field all game, they get worn down. But Bo Nix, 276 through the air, no interceptions, which was the big point for him. No interceptions. Does throw a touchdown pass, looks good. And with that, they're able to pound it on the ground as well. And that, I think, helped them a lot. Tank Bigsby, rolling up about $140 on the ground. And, Auburn really imposed their will. They were in control of this game at halftime, 28-17. And Ole Miss, you felt like, was never really able to get back into it. And I know Matt Corral, we talk about him as, being a Heisman guy. If you're going to win a Heisman Trophy, that's a game, in my mind, you have to win. You got to find a way to get it done. Matt Corral didn't do that. And it's not all on him. I understand it's a team game, but if you're going to be a quarterback that's considered for a Heisman Trophy and you're not on a team that's ranked in the top 5 or 6, you have to beat teams that you're supposed to. And even though they weren't favored, I think a lot of college football fans looked at that and said, that's easy money, man. Taking Ole Miss over Auburn all day. They can score the football, and Auburn, you have no idea what you're getting on offense. But Brian Harsin's done a great job. Auburn, they appear to maybe be turning the corner a little bit. I don't know if they can challenge Bama in the Iron Bowl, but I'm pretty excited to see what it's going to look like because this Auburn team's really kind of catching fire here the last couple of weeks. And so with that, we've got the college football playoff rankings that are going to be coming out this week. First ones of the year. And it's always important to see this because they can shuffle and they move around a lot. And the committee changes their criteria each and every week. They change it to fit their argument. We understand that. But it does provide simple anchor points. And so the AP right now, it's Georgia, Cincinnati, Bama, Oklahoma, Michigan State sitting there at 5. Then you have Ohio State, Oregon, Notre Dame, Michigan, and Wake rounding out the 6 through 10, with Okie State and Auburn sitting there at 11 and 12. I think the playoff selection committee, they'll resemble that to a certain extent. I could see Bama sitting there at 2 based upon who they played and how they looked and just the presumption of how talented they are. I could see Cincinnati probably being 3, maybe 4, but I'm thinking 3. They don't have a huge strength of schedule, but they have a victory, which they controlled the whole game on the road against Notre Dame. And if they're ranked in the top 10, that's going to be considered a huge win, in the eyes of the committee. They might even have Michigan State sitting at 4. Heck, they could have Michigan State at 3 based upon their huge win against Michigan. It was at home, but it was still a big time, top 10 win for a team that will be ranked most likely in the top 10, even after their loss for the committee this week. And then you'll probably have OU sitting there 4 or 5 right there, flip-flop with Michigan State, one of those two. OU hasn't looked great. I know that, everyone's hyped on Caleb Williams and what he's able to do. But if you look back against Kansas a couple weeks ago, I think there's still some pause and cause for concern about how good this Oklahoma team truly is at this point. I think there's a little bipolar nature to them. Ohio State and Oregon could be sitting there at 6 and 7. Wouldn't be shocked to see them flip-flopped, given that Oregon won the head-to-head. And Ohio State, they still have Michigan State. They still have Michigan. They've got Purdue on their schedule. They have the ability to play their way in and play their way up. So I'm not going to get overly excited about it. Notre Dame, all they've been doing is winning. And then you're going to have Michigan with their loss and probably Wake Forest. They may even throw Auburn right there behind a 6-2 Auburn ahead of Wake, just given strength of schedule. But I don't think the ACC is going to get a lot of love. I don't think the Pac-12 is going to get a lot of love. Big 12, somewhat. Big 10, yeah, there'll be a decent amount near the top there. And I think the SEC is going to have their requisite teams up top. We'll see how it all plays out on Tuesday night and then be able to talk about it Wednesday morning. There's a lot going into this, but it's important. Remember this, the anchors of where teams are established early on. And then if they have the schedule to hold that position, or they have to look really impressive doing it, that's all going to come into play here as we figure out and look at the rest of this college football season. That's all from Carp's Corner today. We'll talk to you after the college football rankings, break that down, preview the big games and all the other breaking stories here on Carp's Corner. Thank you.